Welcome to today's webinar, USP 800 Update, What is the Current Status and How do Pharmacists Proceed, is presented by Eric Tosh with Letco Medical. Eric Tosh is Vice President of Compounding Support Services. He has led the Letco Medical Professional Services team for 19 years, and his pharmacy career spans over 28 years. Eric is an adjunct faculty member of the Western University College of Pharmacy, where he teaches compounding. He has published articles in the International Journal of Pharmaceutical Compounding and is a chapter contributor to Remington Science and Practice of Pharmacy 22nd edition. Eric served on the International Academy of Compounding Pharmacists IACP Board of Directors, is a past president, and serves as 2019 chairman of the board. Today's webinar is accredited through ACPE and is worth 1 CE credit hour. CE credit is applied following completion of an evaluation link found on the last slide of the presentation handout. You can find the handout on the lower portion of the GoToWebinar toolbox under Handouts. We are recording this session and will include the recording and evaluation link in a follow-up email that will be delivered to your inbox 1 hour after today's session. Questions may be submitted throughout the webinar using the GoToWebinar toolbox on the right side of your screen under the Questions tab. We will answer the questions submitted following the presentation. If we do not get to your question today, a list of questions and answers will be emailed to all attendees following the webinar. Thank you for joining today's session.
Good afternoon to folks Central Time Zone and East, and good morning still to the folks west of us. Take a quick moment to thank ACA and ARL for the opportunity to present an update on 800 and where we are. And there is some new information as of yesterday that we'll talk about as we get through this. Please do send in any questions you have. I'll make sure we allow time at the end to get to those questions. And again, as Amy said, whatever we're not able to get to, send in, they'll be compiled, and we'll have an answer Q&A document available after the program's over. So really just, the whole point of this is to get folks where we need to kind of what's going on with 800, lots going on out there. I think many of you may have seen that FDA is doing updates while we talk, and USP is figuring out what to do with Chapter 795 and 797, and this has had an impact on 800. I will indicate here that I don't have any conflicts of interest other than to see that patients continue to have access to what they need, and our employees and we work in safe spaces. So that would be my only conflict of interest is, and I don't really see that as one is in the context of this program. This is about employee safety, and we'll get into that. This is background information. You will have this available to read and go through later. What we really want to accomplish today is go through the current standards, how the chapter appeals that are ongoing with 800, what's going on with 795 and 797, how that appeal has affected 800's implementation. We also want to identify and understand NIOSH, what's the difference really between NIOSH and USP 800, and then some ways to consider implementation given we've got this sort of fuzzy gray thing going on, and a lot of folks are still trying to figure out what they need to do. First off, what is USP? Is it a practice, standard, or regulation? And in a nutshell, it's a standard setting organization. I'm not going to read through all of these. Most of you, if you've either been on a previous program about 800 that ARL did or have been doing on their homework, understand that USP is here to set standards. Traditionally, standards of practice. 800 is a bit of a departure in terms of the typical standard of practice, but this is what we have. It's real important that individuals look at more than just 3 chapters, 795, 797, and 800. There's a wealth of information within the document. ARL didn't make any money, I don't own this. You need to have a subscription to USP. It's available online. There's some very, very valuable information in there. In the journal notices of front matter, really outlines how all this is tied together from a standard setting standpoint, and then ultimately how some agencies, either federal or state, utilize this information from a regulatory standpoint. So some of the key things in the USP, the journal notices, the front matter, and we'll talk about a couple of front matter segments. The chapters and the newest really introduced was 825 on nuclear medicine. We're not going to talk about that, but they have their own chapter now. Some key monographs, not only the APIs and excipients, but they're compounding monographs. So this is a tool that you need to have available in your day-to-day practice. Just some reference points that when you do go back and look at USP, if you already have it or are going to get a subscription, some areas where I would certainly recommend you spend some time looking, especially 2.3 talks about the legal recognition where it comes in, Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act of 38, and then more recently, DQSA, the Drug Quality Security Act, other FDA regulations. Your state boards will incorporate either the USP in whole, in toto, or they'll incorporate individual pieces. Better is for you to get the board input to just incorporate relevant parts rather than everything. A couple of points to really get into from a regulatory standpoint. By statute, chapters below 1,000 and above 2,000 are enforceable. This is right out of the document, and then again ties back into federal statutes. In terms of precedents, the monographs take precedence over general chapters, and those take precedence over general notices, but they are all tied together. They're important to be aware of. One key that I wanted to pull out for this, I'm not sure if we've got any 503Bs on the call or have some folks who've got both an A and a B. Just in very plain language, USP has put in the general notices section that 795 and 7 are not applicable to outsourcing facilities because you have to follow the federal guidelines on good manufacturing practices. That also means because the way 795 and 797 are tied together with 800, that in theory at least, 800 would not apply to an outsourcing facility. And we'll get into some of the nuances of that a little bit further on. That does not mean that you don't have to protect your employees. And this really goes back to workplace safety and OSHA. And again, we'll talk about that in a bit. Then some other points of interest. One thing I would comment on, I believe it's in 7.10 or 7.20, I think it's on these slides in the general notices, is a table on rounding. So if you're looking at a certificate of analysis, it tells you, what's a rounding, an acceptable rounding up and down. So there's a tremendous amount of information in this. It's outside of the traditional chapters we look at. For the purposes of 795 and 797 appeal, you have to look at the governance. And fortunately, we had some pharmacies look at the governance policy and how USP's bylaws and governance directs them to handle appeals. And we are in this sort of an unknown spot right now. USP has not had an appeal in a very long time. And so we've got actually 3 different groups that are appealing the beyond use date extension criteria for 795 and 797, and have used this appeal process to get USP to sit down and have dialogue. So this is where this comes from, is out of their governance policy. Specifically, Article 7, Section 7, the appeals, and we'll get into a little bit of detail on this. There is a stepwise process. So, in terms of 30 days to do this and 60 days to do that. So in the process where we are currently, the initial appeal and review was held. Then there was the USP essentially said, no, we're not going to change the BUD extension policy for 795 and 797. That then led to a second step where the appellants said, we want a broader sit down. And so that's where we are now. And in this broader sit down, the appellants will be meeting with 9 committee members, or up to 9, 3 from the Council of Experts, 3 from the Board of Trustees, and then up to 3 additional experts. And these will be folks who will hear the appeal and then the science discussion as to where we are on 795 and 797. The last bullet, we're waiting for a date that works for all parties, is still sort of true as of yesterday. USP had come back to the appellants with a date in January, looking probably January 21st, 22nd. This just came out yesterday, so the three groups that are appealing 795 and 797 have not responded yet as to that January date. To go back a slide, why this is important is that typically once the final decision's made, USP then delays everything for 6 months. Now, many of you may have seen, so far we've talked about 795 and 797. Many of you may have seen that USP put out a notice that it was under appeal, that the implementation of 95 and 97 were delayed, and that now 800 is informational. The key issue here in terms of this December 1st go live date that was supposed to happen is that 800 is not really a standalone chapter. It's specifically tied to 795 and 797. So as long as the chapters are under appeal, sort of by default, the 800 becomes a informational chapter. So if your state board has put in writing in the rules and regulations that 800 goes into effect, then you're tied to that, and you need to check with your board and see what they're going to do. Some state boards have opted not to include 800, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But really, it doesn't matter whether the state board has incorporated USP 800 into its policies or not. This is a workplace safety issue, and effectively OSHA has not only oversight now, but has had oversight for all workplace safety in all locations since the legislation was passed and signed into law back in the 1970s. And we'll have some examples here of where OSHA has already has healthcare on their radar. We've already talked about the appeals. So assuming that the January 21st, 22nd date goes forward, the parties meet. This is an open public hearing. The parties are appealing will be, if you will, the special invited guests. And then because of the stature and the legal stature of USP, their meetings are open to the public. I would expect we'll see some dates come out where, or some registration process for individuals who want to attend the public hearing there in Maryland. So I would encourage those of you who are certainly local, or if you can get away and go to the hearings, do so. What happens after the second hearing? Well, this is a bit of, I won't say speculation, but there is a process. If USP doesn't make any changes and the appellants don't take any additional steps, then USP will set the effective date. And given the January timeframe for the next meeting, they've got a period of time to then make a decision and issue a final statement. So we're probably looking the middle of 2020, sometime between June and August. We would see USP then put 795 and 797 as the effective dates, and then by default, USP 800 would become official and enforceable. If USP agrees to make changes, don't know what that means. They would need to go back, rewrite those chapters. Typically what they do when they rewrite a portion is, and it goes back out for comment, and then they bring those comments in, review them, and make the final draft, and it goes back out, and and that's what you have. If there are no changes, and then the last option is what happens if USP makes no changes and one or more appellants to seek a legal remedy. There is the possibility that some of the appellants would take some sort of, seek some sort of legal relief, whether it's a court injunction, but that is another possibility. And then I don't want to say all bets are off, but to understand, when we would see not only 795 and 797 go live, but that also then has an impact on when 800 becomes official. So just again, to reiterate, based on some of the questions that are coming in, if your state hasn't adopted 800, we will come to that in just a moment. And this is where that part starts. The NIOSH hazardous drug list really was the starting point for what became USP 800. And the whole rationale of why we even have this discussion around USP 800 and workplace safety. Really, the origins, you need to understand where OSHA came from. Over the years, going way back, there have been novels that deal with the dangerous workplace, that some of you may have read in high school. We've all seen the ads for late night law firms suing over asbestos exposures, and now the exposure to the weed killer, the glyphosate. So there's certainly a tradition or a history now since the 1970s of looking at workplace and workplace safety and the onus that is on a business owner, a corporation, to protect employees from potential dangers. So going back to, sort of what is the difference between NIOSH and OSHA, NIOSH is probably more akin to USP in the sense that they do the research, they do the R&D, look at literature, look at, cases, look where there has been an injury in a workplace, and then really establish the standards of what should be the safe practice for that particular industry. So exposure limits to noise, exposure limits to chemicals. OSHA becomes the enforcement arm for that. And then OSHA will look either at industry standards that are developed, or they will look at something like a NIOSH document, something that was developed in-house for guidance on how to address particular workplace safety concerns. So in 2004, we saw the first NIOSH hazardous drug list. Really, if you go back, you'll see it was functionally the oncology drugs that hospitals deal with. We know those are dangerous and create, they are carcinogens in their own right, or at least very toxic. Between 2012 and 2014, there was a change in the format of the NIOSH hazardous drug list. In 2014, we really see the separation out into different tables of the most hazardous, table 1 down through table 3, which are the reproductive risk only drugs. So that's really where you see the page turn in how NIOSH established the hazardous drug handling list and the details that are in that. Also, and again, this is very easy for you to access. This is something you can use your favorite search engine and type in NIOSH hazardous drug list, and it'll pull up. And many of what we're talking about here, you'll see the list of agents. You'll see at the end, I believe it's table 5, and we'll have an example of that a little bit here of what is the protective equipment you need, what are the handling requirements based on the task at hand. In 2013, USP came up with their draft for 800, and it's built on the NIOSH hazardous drug list. If you've not looked at USP 800 yet, you need to, because it really is a more detailed approach to what the NIOSH hazardous drug list set up going back starting in 2004. Now, where does NIOSH get some of their information for exposures? World Health Organization, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Go to WHO, or if you just do a search for IARC, IARC, and much of if you look at the footnotes, either in the NIOSH, particularly in the NIOSH hazardous drug document, it lists paper after paper after paper that really gets into the where they came up with the fact that something is a danger or a risk. So I certainly encourage you to understand the underpinnings of where this information came from, but it's really gleaned from medical literature, from research that's been done, package inserts from manufacturers, and so on. So 800, OSHA and Healthcare. We as healthcare professionals are definitely on OSHA's radar. If you go to the OSHA website, again, do a search, OSHA and Healthcare, you'll go to their homepage for healthcare. A couple of highlights here. There are more people injured in healthcare and social assistance than any other industry. Roughly 150,000, almost 154,000 more cases in the next closest industry, manufacturing. Now, is that because we do better reporting? I would ask those of you who are listening, how many of you have an SOP where you record paper cuts, slips and falls in the pharmacy. Those are all things that OSHA looks at. And I would say that particularly on the healthcare side, especially in the hospital setting, long-term care facilities, and so on, Joint Commission has been very firm on making sure that all injuries are documented. So, we have to keep in mind that is the danger of working in healthcare associated with better reporting, or is it because we really are a much more dangerous industry? I would say it's probably primarily we do a better job of reporting. But this does mean that OSHA looks at what's going on and pays attention. And we've really just not been on the radar from a compounding standpoint and a hazardous drug standpoint outside of the hospital setting and outside the oncology drugs. As an example of being on the radar, a number of years ago, an oncology clinic, I believe it was in Florida, and here's the link to the report. You can pull the PDF. A worker reported anonymously that individual and others in this oncology outpatient clinic were having respiratory symptoms and other symptoms, diarrhea, headaches, and that there had been a spill of an oncology drug during compounding or during the mixing. In this case, NIOSH went in. It was a nurse and a NIOSH professional rather than the OSHA side, the enforcement side. They went in September 2009 and November 2010 and basically did a front door to back door sweep of the facility and looked at operations, did sampling. And at the very front of this report, and this is typical, I didn't disclose, it was not, I guess I should have mentioned this earlier. Part of being a pharmacist, for those of you who don't know me, I was a Navy corpsman and did public health, and part of what we did was, if you will, enforce, but really we had charge of the Navy OSHA program, so my background prior to pharmacy had a good bit of OSHA experience. This is typical. Employers have to post at the beginning of any report, whether it's an OSHA finding or a NIOSH finding, in the employee bulletin board, the results of an inspection. So in this case, after the findings were published, the employer had to post this on the board so that the employees would all be aware of what NIOSH found and what the recommendations were. So we are definitely on the radar. Like I said, they were in this clinic. Some of what they did surface wipe samples. And I abbreviated some of this. These are actually long, almost full paragraphs for each of these bullets in this report. They did surface wipe samples, hand wipe samples, checked airflow of their cabinets, talked to employees about their concerns, reviewed their work-related injury and illness reports for 2 years. I think this was actually 2009, and NIOSH shows up in 2010. So they looked at 3 years worth of workplace injury reports. And again, they expected to see them. If you have none, that's a red flag for OSHA types. You should be recording these and documenting your corrective actions. Again, 800 is not about pharmacy practice. It's about workplace safety. So this last bullet in bold is really, I will say I'll say opinion. Some can argue it. To me, it doesn't matter if your state board adopts this or not. Complaints go to either OSHA or state OSHA, and about half the states have essentially what's a memorandum of understanding that they will parallel not only enforcement, but fines, whatever OSHA standards are, the state will enforce those same standards. For the most part, the states that do parallel and have this MOU with OSHA, it is for state employees, not every employee in the state. But just be aware that you could be in a state that does have an agreement with OSHA. So it's possible that if you have an employee or someone files complaint with OSHA, instead of it being the federal guys and gals with a badge, it'll be from someone from the state who would come in and look. And they will look back to 800 or at a minimum NIOSH hazardous drug list for guidance on what you should be doing from a practice standpoint. So again, I can't stress enough, doesn't matter from my perspective whether your board of pharmacies adopted 800 or not. This is a workplace safety issue, and ultimately, at a minimum, OSHA is going to come in. If your state has adopted 800, then it could be state board or an OSHA type agency. Here's where the dollars meet the road. This is the current fines. Again, you can look this up on the OSHA website or just Google OSHA Fines or Bing or DuckDuck, whatever your favorite website is. The fines escalate from $13,000 per violation up to $132,000 per violation for willful or repeated. Failure to abate is probably what we're looking at here with 800. We have now known since 2013 that 800 was on its way. We've known since 2004 that NIOSH has put out a hazardous drug list, and at the end of that list are handling strategies and what you need to wear in terms of personal protective equipment to handle these hazardous drugs. So one could certainly make an argument that you'd be looking at $13,000 per day beyond the abatement date. So if December 1st is the abatement date, then and one of these folks walks into your pharmacy at the end of February, you've functionally got 30 days or 20 or 90 days, or if you're open 20 days a month, 60 days of failure to abate. So you could certainly build out an 800 compliant facility for a fraction of the cost of the fines. I have not ever seen OSHA put people out of business from an administrative fine standpoint. They will make an example. You might have to lawyer up and go in and argue down the fine. They will really, they're a little different agency than when they were first founded. And if they do try to work with you and make sure that you get where you need to be, but be aware these are the potentials for failing to get on board with 800 and protect your staff. So what's the difference between NIOSH hazardous drug list and USP 800? We talked about this already. 2004, all the drugs are in one category. It's typically updated every other year. There was supposed to be a new list out last year, 2018. The new list is supposed to be out in December. The 2018 list is actually due out in December this year. So be looking for it. And then each task assigns the type of equipment, PPE that needs to be worn or engineering controls that need to be in place. And the next slide is an example. A couple of slides will have an example of that. Do refer to NIOSH Table 5 in the hazardous drug list. Compare what it states to USP 800. You will find that they really parallel very closely, except for one area. But they talk about, just like USP 800, the NIOSH list talks about receiving and shipping, how to handle finished drugs, how to handle compounding, and even breaks compounding down into the type of compounding it is, the administration. So at a long-term care facility or at a hospital, how does one garb up when administering hazardous drugs? So 800 does really very essentially parallels and piggybacks onto NIOSH Table 5 especially. So here's an example from Table 5. If you're going to compound a topical drug, got to wear double chemotherapy gloves. It's just out like 800. Got to wear a protective gown. Got to wear eye and face protection. Respiratory protection if you don't have a controlled device, and then even outlines type of control. Note that there is no requirement for a negative pressure room here. And in fact, at least in the last iteration, the 2016, which is the last one that came out, there were no requirements for a negative pressure room. So that's really the biggest divergence from the physical facility and operational aspect between the NIOSH hazardous drug list and USP 800 is the addition now of a negative pressure room to contain the hazardous drug, especially in case of a spill or an incident. So again, USP 800 really builds on NIOSH, references it, and I've already talked about the facility design. Certainly there are more details in 800 on your SOPs, the duties of supervisory personnel. While it's not a requirement yet, I expect it will be. It's a should, not a shall, on a health monitoring program. And certainly if you're working with hazardous drugs and there are mechanisms to monitor exposures such as lab values, particularly BHRT, we can do saliva testing for the hormones. You can get baseline levels and then get follow-up levels. And this helps confirm your staff are handling the drugs properly and aren't already in an area where they're at risk, if you will. So what do you do to prepare? Well, yeah, again, it's not pharmacy practice, but I do recommend the all-in approach. Whether you're looking at NIOSH hazardous drug list or 800, again, the main difference is the build out of the room and then some of the other back-end operational pieces is you just go in and commit to full compliance, get your facility designed, design the negative pressure room, do all the operational requirements that you need to. Understand now that there's a bit more breathing room with the appeal of 795 and 797 that pharmacies really are looking probably at mid-2020 to get the work done and modification and any modifications to processes accomplished. So I think at this point, you've got a little bit of breathing room, but I don't see that it's totally goes away. I think at a minimum you're still going to have to deal with NIOSH, and given the presence of the hazardous drug list and its use in 800, you just need to really want to get all in and be prepared, because the alternative is to do what I call sort of a combo. You're almost there, is get everything else done except for the negative pressure room. What we see from a practical standpoint is an HVAC retrofit and the disruption to business is expensive. Perhaps 800 gets delayed or sidebarred, and all you have to do is deal with NIOSH hazardous drug list. But you still are going to have the same requirements for engineering controls, some sort of containment hood, gown, gloves, mask. All that's already in the list and can be used from a compliance standpoint. To me, it's impractical to try to go back and do a refit. One other thing I would highly recommend you do if you're going to do this sort of almost there but not quite is bring in an industrial hygienist to do a site survey. They'll hook up the little air sampling monitors, a breathing zone for the staff when they're doing a live compounding exercise. They'll set up room monitors, and they will document and validate that your processes are protecting staff. This is essentially what I would call an insurance policy. That if you don't go all in, you can at least show that your processes are not generating hazardous drugs into the environment. And this is not uncommon in the other part of the OSHA world, whether it's a paint shop where they're making sure that the staff aren't exposed to organic volatiles. They're going to set up air monitoring in the paint booth, outside the paint booth, and look and make sure that the containment that you've got is proper. There are certainly industrial hygienists who could be brought in and look at your operation and do the process, and that gives you a little bit of, not only validates your process, shows your staff that what they're doing is safe, and also provides some documentary evidence that you're not generating a hazardous environment. Again, from a regulatory standpoint, not sure how much that'll fly if your board has incorporated 800 into its rules. They're going to default to the all-in position. Really wanted to kind of get through this so that we get to some of the questions. If you'll give me just a moment, I'll read through what we've got here and get those answered as quickly as possible. And then certainly you continue to send them in and bear with me. So we've talked about, there's a question here about PBMs, how to handle inquiries from PBMs about compliance with 800. I would just, show them, say that if you've got a plan, that you're in the process of working on it, let them know. Point out that USP has published, and do a cut and paste of the email that USP sent out. I believe NCPA has forwarded it. For ICP members, you've seen it in their newsletter. Their APHA has forwarded the information from USP that 800 is informational. I would remind the PBM that it is informational for now, and that as conditions change, you will adjust and adopt accordingly. So I think that the PBMs, their contracts can be kind of quirky, so it's going to be whatever you're going to have some dialogue as the bottom line. There was a question about time due to 795, 797. Hopefully we've answered that. We're looking now probably third week of January as a reminder where the groups will meet. And then somewhere in 30 to 60 days, I would expect USP to issue their final statement on their intention to change or not change 795, 797. So at the earliest, summer, we would see those chapters go live, and then by default 800 becomes enforceable. Again, if there's any changes, they're going to make modifications in the chapters, then it's at the earliest summer and very likely much longer. Question about kits for surface wipes. I have started to see some kits being advertised. They are, in terms of the sampling, I know that a couple of the labs, and I can't speak for all labs, but I do believe that ARL has been doing some exploration. I'll let them answer on that in terms of what they are able to do to take samples. And I have seen some kits being offered on the internet for this, and at least one of the kits does state that it's got a marker for progesterone. And I'll defer ARL, any comment on the service wipe capabilities to analyze those?
Yeah, so ARL is currently offering wipe testing for all hormones and methotrexate. All hormones, I shouldn't say all hormones. I think it's 8 of the most common compounded hormones and methotrexate, and are continuing to work on additional chemotherapy drugs.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I've got a question that's, I will give you what I'll call sort of a generic answer. This is not specifically related to 800. Someone's asking about compounding peptide injections. That really is a function of the Drug Quality Security Act and what's allowed. There have been some recent announcements, actually back in August. We'll kind of bifurcate this answer a little bit here. Broadly, just as a reminder, the Drug Quality Security Act, DQSA, provided for two different, from a statutory standpoint, two different types of compounding: 503A, traditional pharmacy; 503B, outsourcing facility. 503As may compound anything that has a USP monograph, USP NF monograph, not dietary supplement monograph, component of an FDA-approved product, even if the product's no longer on the market, as long as it was not off the market for safety reasons. I'll give an example of that. And the third option is an item that's been nominated for consideration by the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee, found on List 1. FDA is going to exercise enforcement discretion until the committee gives a thumbs up or down. And then if they get a thumbs up, it's published in the Federal Register, and you may compound with those. I can tell you, as an example, GHRP2 and GHRP6, two peptides that were out there, were nominated, and FDA did not put them on List 1. They were actually, I believe, put on List 3, which means that there was insufficient clinical evidence provided for the PCAT committee to consider them. Neither of those peptides have a USP monograph, or are they a component of an FDA-approved drug product. The only peptide in that family that has an FDA-approved drug product is sermorelin or sermorelin, depending on your preference of pronunciation. The commercial product is no longer on the market, but it was not withdrawn for safety reasons. So under that nuance of it's a component of an FDA-approved product that was off the market for reasons other than safety, that one could be done. This summer, FDA announced that they were going to move a number of items over to the biologics list. Virtually all insulin now is on the biologics list. HCG, the chorionic gonadotropin, that has been a compounding item for both 503As and I think some 503Bs. The HCG, effective March of 2020, I believe it's March 23rd, 2020, and it's a long list of items, and you can find it through the FDA website. So there are a number of biologic agents, not just insulins and HCG. There are a wide range of things that previously, based on this list and the thinking, FDA has, even if they were maybe originally classified as a biologic, many of them were probably classified as a drug. They've now all been moved to the biologics list. There's a separate guidance for industry on compounding biologics. It's very restrictive. Functionally, it will be under the way this guidance document was written by the FDA. And I will say that FDA states on these that they're not legally binding on anyone, but I can assure you if they walk into your pharmacy, they will utilize this as if it were a rule and legally binding. So be prepared if you're going to compound any of the biologics, including insulins for cats, for whatever reason. If you're manipulating anything on that list now, the FDA essentially, I don't see a pathway for 503As to compound HCG or any of these 503Bs. If they register for a biologics license, there might be an avenue for them to do those. But again, please read the guidance for industry document on biologics, and once you read through sort of the torturous language that the FDA uses and the footnotes and the federal statutes they cite, broadly peptides, anything that's a biologic in nature, is going to be a challenge to compound in the future, especially for the 503As. That's opinion. It's based on my read of the documents and some input from others. I would certainly, if that's a core component of your business, you may need to consult an attorney who's versed on federal statutes, especially as they relate to manufacturing, compounding, and so on. I would say best bet is it's probably a no-go. Looks like we've got another question or two here. Great question on what to do with the hazardous drug waste. There's a third document that's recently come out. It's an EPA document on hazardous drug disposal. Not necessarily the same drugs as you see on the NIOSH hazardous drug list. So, you've got your items that are hazardous to ship, flammable alcohol, for instance, or acids, poisons. You've got your hazards that, from a handling standpoint, from a compounding, which 800 addresses, and the EPA document on hazardous drug disposal. I would certainly suggest, and this goes back to my old hospital days, treat the hazardous drug waste from your compounding process as you would a chemo drug in a hospital. They've got special biologic disposal bags you'll need to get with your local. I would certainly encourage you to do it officially rather than just try and put it in the dumpster. Most of the waste management companies have an arm that does hazardous drug disposal or waste disposal. Sometimes the fire departments twice a year will have a community, give us all your hazardous stuff. So if you're in a smaller town, you may want to talk to your fire department, see what they do for hazardous drug and hazardous chemical pickup, and you may be able to just do it that way. But functionally, for those of you who have buddies in the hospital system, I would follow their pattern, which is you're going to have a container that's got the biohazard label on it. You're going to save that, and then by working with a company that does official hazardous waste disposal, you'll have a paper trail. You'll be able to show that they picked up X pounds of hazardous waste on Thursday at 10 a.m. So if anyone comes back and questions, what are you doing? You'll have the paper trail to show it. That really wasn't addressed by 800. It's kind of, folks were left to sort of decipher that. And I would say just relying on how Joint Commission requires hospitals do it would be a good pattern for your community pharmacies. Let's see, let's see, about a cream. Yeah, yellow chemo bin. So someone's asking a similar question. The question, can you deactivate this stuff? Yeah, there are some deactivation. If you look at 800, they give examples. You typically want to have something that's an oxidizer, so something like bleach or a hydrogen peroxide. But by doing that, this really kind of goes to the concept of in USP 800, the deactivation, decontamination, cleaning. You have to validate that. So if you want to do those steps, certainly you can do it. If it's like a container and you're trying to reuse a container, if it's a plastic container, don't. I know that we're trying to control costs, but you don't know what's going to adsorb into the plastic. Certainly, any of the oxidizers like a bleach or a hydrogen peroxide or something that could, in theory, deactivate the chemical could also affect the plastic itself. So, if you're trying to clean stuff and reuse it, I would limit that to glass, not to any of the plastics or your consumables. And then everything goes in the yellow chemo bag or bucket. But that's an area that's really kind of the unknown right now in terms of how to address that. The question on non-compounded drugs, how to handle non-compounding, counting out drugs from stock bottles. USP 800 outlines, again, this is why you need to get the whole USP. At a minimum, you can buy the chapter 800. I think it's $150 is what USP charges for it. But it outlines the various steps, including things like tablet counting. You need to do a risk assessment. So look at what's the risk. I think back to when I was in practice, 100-count bottle of estradiol tablets. Remember, estradiol is on the NIOSH hazardous drug list, so by default governed by 800. If you got a 100-count bottle, really not much dust at the end, you do a risk assessment and say, okay, this is, you have to document you did the assessment and that it is, given the number of scripts you do, not an issue, but I've got a separate counting tray and it's wiped down with alcohol, whatever that might be. And that's part of your SOP. You get a 500-count bottle of a generic estradiol, there's a layer of dust in the bottom. Guess what? That layer of dust over time, that's something that's breathable. So perhaps your SOP now is, from a risk assessment standpoint, I don't no longer buy the 500,000 count stock bottle of estradiol 2 milligram tablets. I buy 30s or 100s. Now I can avoid having to do those procedures potentially in this full 800 control environment. But 800 does outline the types of activities that occur commonly in a pharmacy and what you need to do. So whether it's a NIOSH Table 5 that does the same thing, or 800 that just goes in a little bit more depth, refer to that for particular activities. But really 800 and NIOSH both focus on if it's a friable tablet, if you're crushing, grinding, you're generating dust, or you're working with an API, then you have to handle under this full 800 containment. Question about handling Table 2 and 3. The NIOSH does distinguish between, especially Table 1 is the most hazardous, and you have different binning requirements for that within USP 800. Table 2 and 3, it really becomes, when you look at the chapter, you do a risk assessment and look at what do I need to do. And really, it's pretty straightforward. Table 1, you've got the hood has to be directly vented. Table 2 and 3, you can double HEPA filter the cabinet air back into the room, but the room still has to be vented. So no matter what you do, the room has to vent. And I would certainly, from that, suggest that you're going to need to handle 2s and 3s the same way, but you'll need to do an assessment of risk of, is there something unusual about one of the items on 2 or 3 that's different than the rest, and then I have to handle them slightly differently. Question about separate corner of the pharmacy, separate tray and spatula to count hazardous drugs in a retail pharmacy. Again, that's a risk assessment. I think that for most of these, if you're counting a mitotane tablet or an estradiol tablet, and you've got individuals, and let's say from package inserts that it's a reproductive risk, a teratogen, some sort of cancer risk, you may want to say, okay, if I've got a female employee of childbearing age, she won't handle these items. Again, that becomes an individual decision, do the risk assessment. And it's going to vary from pharmacy to pharmacy. Some are going to be very conservative and say, I'm not going to do those things anymore, or I'm going to have a separate area. Again, look at, is this generating dust? Is it exposing my staff? How do I assess that risk? Someone's writing here, they're a solely owned pharmacy, is just the employee of one, do you still have to do all this? I would say that, yeah, I mean, that becomes a discussion with your lawyer as to what, if you accept the risk and no one else is going to be exposed. But I would make a what if, a suppose comment here as we're getting near in the last few minutes here. Let's say you drop a jug of progesterone that's, micronized to 5 microns. You clean it up, but that's highly micronized. It goes throughout the pharmacy. You've got a customer who, is an internet PhD, and they are on top of stuff, and they're concerned that you're exposing them to the hazardous drug. And remember, part of the 800 requirements are you have to label that finished drug as a hazardous drug. There's a little sticker that says you're getting a compounded preparation, you're getting a hazardous drug. So now Mrs. Smith, who's been getting her progesterone and estrogen combination for a decade and a half, now has a new label that says it's a hazardous drug. Perhaps Mrs. Smith lost a husband to asbestos, and she calls OSHA and files a complaint. What's OSHA's jurisdiction in that? I really don't know. I'm kind of reaching, but I would certainly suggest that OSHA doesn't distinguish whether you're a sole proprietor or have 100 employees. Are you following workplace safety guidelines? And is that risk extend potentially to consumers? That I can't answer. I would just suggest that there's some things that you need to be aware of. Someone looking for free SOPs. I've seen some templates that are very bare bones. You end up having to do quite a bit of work on the SOPs if you download a free one. I don't know if, I think that the International Journal of Pharmaceutical Compounding did a USP 800 assessment document. They do have, I believe, some SOPs that are probably some of the least expensive out there, and they really are an outline. You have to do a fair amount of fill in the blank, and which is fine because now it's tailored specifically to your operations, and those are good bare bones starting point. But most of the SOPs are out there you're going to see are going to be between $10,000 and $20,000, or between $2,000 to $3,000 and $20,000, depending on whether they write them all for you or how much meat is on the bone. The question about if you do a risk assessment, can you do 2s and 3s in a regular IV room under positive pressure? No. If it's a powder, the document's very clear. 800 is very clear that if you're working with, let's say, progesterone, you want to make an injectable progesterone, an injectable testosterone. It's on the hazardous drug list, and powders that are compounded and manipulated have to be in a cabinet in a negative pressure room. So then you'd be looking at a negative pressure sterile room as opposed to a positive pressure sterile room. There have been some, and the chapter addresses doing hazards with non-hazards. If you do that, you have to label everything in the room as a hazard and treat it as a hazard because of potential cross-contamination. So I think there's some folks who've been trying to look for ways around this and use a risk assessment. If you're working with powders with active pharmaceutical ingredients, it very clearly states in 800 that has to be, all that compounding manipulation needs to be in some sort of containment device like a hood in a room until it's in its final dosage form, essentially ready to dispense to the patient. Where you find the list of hazardous drugs, again, use a search engine, whether it's Google or Bing or Opera, whatever search engine. If you just type in NIOSH hazardous drug list, you'll get multiple hits. And like I say, the newest list will be out December of 2019, and they usually add 2 or 3 and sometimes take some off. So just be looking within the next month or so. We should see the newest list. Right now, you have a 2016 list. Let's see, small facility, only do 2 and 3. Don't have a negative pressure room. Closed system transfer device. yeah, this is a very long question. Sorry. I would go back to look at what the item is that you're doing. You may be able to use closed system transfer. If you're working with a powder, that's really not going to be an option. So if you're just reconstituting something's commercially available that's on list 2 or 3, I would default to that. But the compounding aspect really does dictate that you're going to be working in a cabinet in a negative pressure room. But if you got something very small, very, one or 2 SKUs, it's very focused, then the risk assessment may work for you, and you may be able to, I don't know if anyone can just flat out avoid a room, especially with powders, but there may be some ability to manage that. And we've got lots more questions, and we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to see if there's anything else here that that's different, and then I'll answer the rest of these and get them out. Someone asking about Texas and HVAC. I would start, this is really whether you're in Texas or elsewhere, reach out to whoever does the HVAC for your current just pharmacy. Ask them some questions. Are you familiar with negative pressure? Do you know what's engaged in adjusting pressure in a closed room? And if they don't know, ask them. Who, unfortunately, I've done lots of web searching. There just isn't a national repository by state of experts on HVAC. Talk to friends that maybe have already gone down the path, see who they're using, and check with your local HVAC person and see. But this has been the biggest challenge, is the HVAC piece. I wish I had the magic answer for you there. All right, well, since we're getting on the last couple of minutes, I'll be quiet. If any of the folks at ARL have anything they need to jump in, I want to give them an opportunity to speak, and then we'll wrap this up and answer questions via spreadsheet.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's session. We did have a good amount of questions, and we will send those out as an FAQ. As Eric mentioned, it'll be in the next few days with the holiday. Just be aware of that, and we'll get that to you as soon as possible. Also, too, if you are needing the 1 hour of CE credit, make sure that you complete that evaluation link that was found in the last slide of the handouts. That evaluation link and the recording of today's webinar will also be sent out to you 1 hour after the end of today's session, and that'll be in your email inbox. CE credit will be uploaded to NABP accounts approximately 2 weeks after completion of the evaluation. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and have a good day.